what's interesting here is the extent with which people in the university sector and the higher education sector see that micro-credentials are going to be a very credible alternative to more traditional degree programs within quite a tight time frame, within 2025. Some people seeing it as happening even faster than that. So micro-credentials, while there's a lot of noise around them, I don't think they're going to go away from everything that I'm going to talk about in the next slide, where we've actually been at the moment offering a free online masterclass on micro-credentials in recognition of that this is a growing area, but there's a lot of confusion about what we mean. So we'll put a link to this in the chat box for participants. About 700 participants are currently doing this free online masterclass on the FutureLearn platform. And notably on the next slide, thanks Mairead, last week we asked the participants what their views were. Now, most of these are coming out of the higher education sector. There are some from industry, but I think what's really interesting in the slide in front of you is that no one in response to this poll thought that micro-credentials would not become much more of a core feature of the higher education sector and credential ecology more generally. So 0 results for the no option. On the next slide, I'm going to again go back to drawing on this very recent Hole in IQ report, which, as I say, we will give you a link to. Here, what helps us understand is that micro-credentials are part of what's often described as the wider unbundling of higher education. Again, it's a bit like I was describing that no longer is it just one goes to school and one goes to university and you have your credential. But actually, there are lots of different forms of micro-credentials, or should we call them certificates and badges? And maybe they're not all actually best thought of as micro-credentials. So on the next slide, what we've attempted to do is just to put things in a slightly more simple format to understand this new and evolving credential ecology. I think most of us are familiar with macro credentials in the top left-hand quadrant. That's traditional degrees and so forth. But what we're seeing now is that top right-hand quadrant being filled with formal and semi-formal, accredited and stackable, quite quality assured credentials of one form or another, more than just simply badges or awards that don't necessarily have that much status behind them. So on the final slide for me, before I hand over, I just think I've got a little box tick, the final slide. Thank you. As was introduced at the start, I had the privilege to serve most of last year on the European Commission's consultation group in developing this final report published in December on micro-credentials. And what we've attempted to do here is provide a much more explicit definition of what we're referring to as credible forms of short learning experiences leading to some proof of the outcomes that's been assessed against transparent standards. My last observation, as well, is this report happens to also produce a sort of roadmap with building blocks, and in producing our own roadmap for Ireland to be a real hub, an international hub of excellence in micro-credentialing, we've made really quite explicit connections between the two. And I think that's a point that Mairead will probably pick up as I pass back to her now.
Thanks, Mark. Apologies if there's any delay. I've been admitting people into the room as you've been speaking as well. So I have the con, as they say. So when we took to write this report, I think one of the really interesting things is that Mark has set the context. You know, sometimes it's called the Wild West of micro-credentials. There's thousands of them out there. We're looking, and one of the really important things for us was the notions of developing this idea of currency, cohesion, and consistency. And we use these as metaphors, as guiding metaphors for that roadmap. So, and within the recommendations that we made. Perhaps another C that we could and should add, as Tracy said, is that the notion of collaboration, because I think that's one of the areas that micro-credentials really draw upon, is the notion of this collaboration between education and training providers and industry for this notions of co-construction and development and recognition of work-based learning. So in the roadmap itself, as I just changed now the slides, if you bear with me, we asked we posed sort of key questions for industry and the higher education sectors, and we really wanted to sift out and to understand the position and the potential that micro-credentials hold for both training and education provision, whether that's upskilling, cross-skilling, or the recognition of current education and work-based learning that happens on the site and on the job. And also with regards to the recruitment processes and micro-credentials becoming part of somewhat the recruitment process that are engaged in by industry, and they're part of recognition of learning, etc. So these are the three sort of principal areas in the roadmap. We go, so why do micro-credentials make sense for you, and why they might be potentially something that you might want to integrate as part of your provision in your own industry. Who, and how should you engage with them? And then how can micro-credentials can give an added advantage or a USP? So the conversation around micro-credentials is driving discussion and more engagement between education and training. And that's really something that we are really grateful for, I suppose, because in one way it takes us out of our silos. And we know that in some institutions and across institutions in Ireland, we have relationships with industry, but the potential of micro-credentials, I think, is for more in-depth co-construction of learning, the recognition of skills and knowledge that are developed in the working place, and providing validation and recognition of those. And I think that's an important element of micro-credentials that we unpack in this roadmap. We also asked the question about the potential for co-delivery of learning, because again, we know that a lot of this happens already within work-based and work-based learning environments. I suppose another key aspect, if we look at the potential of micro-credentials, is looking at the notion of the learner, and whether that's an employee or a university student or an education student of some kind. So is that it provides this notion of having smaller forms of certified learning, which can be transformative for both employers and employees, when in particular they're juggling the various aspects of life. And I think we all know about juggling, particularly if you've only just sent the kids back to school in the last week or two. We also unpack, I suppose, in the roadmap, the notions of lifelong and life-wide learning and how micro-credentials can support these, which is a really, really important. And I think Tracy made reference to the transversal skills that need to be developed consistently and constantly throughout a career and engagement and work industry. Obviously, we're not suggesting that micro-credentials are a panacea, a cure-all, but really they do provide a potential to build in Ireland a more reflective and reflexive and responsive training and education system. Mark has alluded, our current education and training system, and I'm talking really around the higher education, is a system designed really for the 19th century, when we know that we have demands now in the 21st century that exceed and expand and stretch that system to its core. So really we need to look at potentially these new solutions with regards to providing certified learning for learners. So what we've done in the report is we have structured the recommendations around 3 key areas. And I will give you a flavour in the next few slides about what those recommendations are. But really for any roadmap, there's 3 key areas that we're looking at, is awareness building. And again, going to our national survey, it's really, really important that we get awareness and build awareness both in industry but amongst employers and also within higher education. And I'll speak to some of the initiatives that currently have started in Ireland to support that. Also, we're talking about capability and competency mapping. So what we were saying in this roadmap is we understand that a lot of work-based training is provided. So what we're saying is that organizations can look, they should reflect on that and see whether that competency mapping of current provision can be built into a micro-credential provision. We also talk about funding and piloting because, as you know, and as you are all very aware of, none of this happens without resourcing. But I think it's key that we develop out these pilots so that we develop scalable models, so that if workplace learning happens in a site of work or etc., a site of work or online or in a work context, that there are rapid models of validation and assessment. And we know that there has been funding through the Human Capital Initiative to support that in the recognition of prior learning, etc. So just some of the recommendations that have come through from it is that we know that there is really a need for us to align with national and international definitions. Why is that important? It's really, really important in this notion of currency, so that if a learner or an employee who gains a micro-credential can use that, it's portable and it's recognized for them to enter into other job areas or to enter into other organizations, but also for the employer, for their ability to recognize and to ensure that the credential that's being presented to them is valid and it is recognized. We think also this is about the awareness point of it. The national dialogue is needed and sectoral participation in education to mature the current level of awareness about the potential of micro-credentials to recognize work-based learning, experiential learning, and life-wide learning. And I'll talk about one of the initiatives that has happened in the university sector of late, which is part of that wider activities that is needed. We spoke about the support, the capability mapping, really, really important, because I think we need to build on what we have. A lot of what is done is really, really good. I think, you know, Bridie has worked with UCC and worked out part of the Taste for Success for the digital badges, and that was really, really important. Those type of initiatives are crucial. So I think we need to build on those type of initiatives, and we need to, so that we develop capacity within our system. I think to do this, it's really, really important that we have a national steering group with all the key stakeholders brought into play, because this concerns so many of us. You know, it concerns so many of us. We need to change our education provision. We understand that. We need to make it more flexible and responsive, but we need to do that in tandem with other, and I think in our roadmap, we've said, you know, we've had one of our key industry experts who came in and was working with us on this, and they were talking about, you know, sometimes education and training providers sometimes give what industry they give what industry they think industry needs, as opposed to what they actually need. So we need to get that all players are around the table. I suppose an interesting aspect also that we've brought into this is the notion of giving also the employee voice, and that's really, really important. What we also want to harness in the roadmap is developing out scalable notions of co-design, co-development of learning opportunities, and also co-construction is what we term it in the micro-credential place. So there are some of the recommendations. And just to briefly move on to some of the survey results. And again, we're looking at this from a perspective of a survey that we completed last July, and the results are laid out, and the findings are laid out in the report. But this is really just to give you some of an overview of some of the key findings. The key takeaways really for us was that of those who participated in the survey, and obviously the survey was limited, and what we're calling it is giving us indicative results. We hope to repeat the survey into the future so that we get more of a taste of how this area is maturing as it progresses and over the years. Because as Mark has said, micro-credentials are everywhere, and particularly in the COVID pandemic, with the requirement for training and the opportunity for training, there has been a huge upsurge in the demand for them. So we know from the survey, both of employers and employees, that there's inconsistent levels of maturity and differing levels of maturity in current understanding of what micro-credentials are. We know that both employers and employees are interested in what micro-credentials and the potentials of them. We know that also that employees in particular want to have the skills and knowledge that they are currently engaged in their places of work be recognised. And I thought that was a really, really interesting, because a lot of the research on micro-credentials, which both myself and Mark complete in this area, and Elaine and Crowher, is that it's always looking to the future, But the employees who participated in the survey, they were very keen to have recognition for what they're doing currently. And I think that's a key thing, and possibly one for the education and training providers to latch onto. And then there was also this note that there's common characteristics. So both employers and employees wanted micro-credentials to do specific things for them. So just to look at, so this just gives you a breakdown of some of the more in-depth findings. So employers are interested in micro-credentials and want to know more. So the question we asked is, to what extent is your company or organization interested in integrating micro-credentials? And the majority were exploring, the majority were likely they wanted to consider it. So it was becoming an option, and some of them were actively engaged in exploring it. I suppose the next slide, really, this slide here really came in, to what extent is your company or organization interested in integrating micro-credentials into training and CPD? Again, a really high result coming out of that, whether they're extremely or very interested in learning more. So this shows that within those surveys that there was an appetite to learn more about what the potential of micro-credentials can offer. I suppose from our perspective as researchers, we wanted to see, because we're immersed in the world of micro-credentials, but had that filtered down, and this is why this question is really, really important. Had it already filtered down at the time of July when we set the question and when we set the survey out, it hadn't featured within recruitment process at that stage. So it'll be interesting when we go back to repeat the survey that micro-credentials, to see how have they infiltrated, particularly in light of all of the upsurge in learning that has taken during the COVID pandemic. The other things was that what factors would influence your company or organization's decision to integrate micro-credentials? Obviously, again, and this is the work-life balance thing, but also flexibility, the ability to personalize. So these are really key things, aren't they? You know, the ability to be really responsive to the learning needs of the learner is really, really important. Cost is obviously a significant part of it. Stackability, and stackability here means is that you can put micro-credentials together to achieve more in-depth learning in a specific area, but also potentially that stackability there will provide for the provision or the qualification to receive a major award. The next was there was validation. So validation comes a little bit down from a recognized training provider. This is interesting because you'll see from the European definition there is that the validation aspect is really, really important. And again, if we're going to build trust in the system, etc., that validation could be really important. The next issue is assessment and accreditation, and portability were also came in. From the employee side of it, you can see that, you know, as I said before, to improve my skills and subjects relevant to my job, we were actually quite surprised at that. We thought it would be all about people, because of the research and what we're working in, we thought it would be all about people, you know, thinking about upskilling or moving on or trying to get into other areas. But actually for the recognition of what they're doing currently, I think that's a really, really interesting point. Also to keep up to date within the sector. So people really want to stay on top of the area that they're in and learn more about it. So that's a great thing, you know, so there's obviously an appetite for continued learning and learning on the job. To learn new skills, to be able to change up was high, and then to attain promotion within my current capacity. But I think those sort of objectives really it's similar to those of the employer. They really want to see recognition of what's going on now and for micro-credentials to do that. So one of the areas that I wanted to discuss, or just to give sort of a taste of what is happening in the area around education and training providers. Under the Human Capital Initiative, the universities, in tandem with the Irish Universities Association, received funding, and it's called the MC2 project, and that's to build out multi-campus micro-credential capacity across the university sector. This is really interesting because it's really a significant move by the higher education to recognize these types of smaller awards to recognize learning. There's a significant industry component on this, and I'm delighted that Bridie is on the steering group from the employer side of it as part of that group, because this really is their role, is to keep the universities honest, so that again that we're really addressing the demand and working for the demand that is seen out there. So that's more information is available about the multi-campus initiative available on the IUA website. I'm currently DCU's representative on that, and DCU obviously has played an important part in microcredentials. You know, we've delivered Ireland's first credit-bearing microcredential fintech financial innovation. But we hope that this is not just going to be something that individually DCU will do, but it's going to be something now that the sector, the wider higher education and training sector, and we know that the QQI has also taken moves as well. In last December, it recognised the first handful of micro-credentials there provided by private providers. So we can see really that education and training is starting to get embraced with what micro-credentials, the provision of micro-credentials within the system. But again, as I said before, if we were looking at, I'm going to change our title for, I think the word collaboration is really, really important. I suppose just to call out, and I'm going to just finish up now, is that DCU, we have a huge interest. We have a huge research interest, obviously, in micro-credentials, and leading out on this, we've created the National Observatory, the Microcredential Observatory, and I'm sure somebody will put the link up in the chat. But what we've done here is to provide a sort of a central portal of research and developments that is going on. So these are available and they're openly available to all. So we hope you can make use of them. And finally, if I think I hopefully have covered everything, just a really big thank you to our SkillNet partners, and I'll hand back, hopefully, I'll hand over, I think, to Eamon now. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million, Mairead. Thanks, Mairead and Mark. That's great. Lots of good information there. I'll just hand over straight to Eamon as we'll let everybody get off to their lunch.
Thank you all for attending. I realise we're over time, and I'll just be very brief. Two issues. First of all, sincere thanks to SkillNet Ireland, because they are providing us in a very special way with an access to stuff that we that is not possible anyplace else in Ireland. And I think that they have to be commended for that, and thank them very much. Secondly, sincere thanks, absolutely sincere thanks to Carol Brake, Brady Corrigan, our own three SkillNets, and especially to our host, Grania, who did tremendous work today. From our point, and just briefly to get to it, it's been, the emphasis has come out right across the system. It's about proof. Microcredentials, to quote Mark's earlier definition, is about proof. It's about capability, and it's about competency. We're trying, maybe Jesuitical in our approach, but we're trying to separate out academic capability from professional competency. And a very simple but brief example, in the medical world with FDA type inquiries into a company, nowadays with automation, the majority of defects that are detected in an audit are human, because the machines are so automated. And when the guy comes back for the next audit, he looks at the previous audit and he sees Eamon Murphy was deficient or whatever, and he asks the manager, what have you done to upskill Eamon Murphy? In the past, it was sufficient to say, I put him on a course, I sent him to DCU, to UL, or whoever it is, QQI, and I did. Now they are looking for proof that the learning has been applied. They want evidence that not alone have I attended the course, but that I am professionally competent. And that's the Jesuitical space that we in the ICVE are trying to propose in the next state of development. We really believe, others might agree, but we believe that the micro-credentials in the academic space are very well developed, very clearly understood, portability, etc., etc. What's not so clear is the micro-credentials on the professional competency side, proof that you have applied it to a sufficient level. And we see going forward that there will be two kinds of micro-credentials. One, the academic, that you've got the knowledge, but secondly, there will be a professional competency micro-credential that certifies that you are able to apply this at a very senior level. This has been solved very successfully in the software world with the as to how much of open source material and aggregators exist. No such other concept exists in other industries besides that. I don't want to delay, but our dream or the next phase of the development, and we don't want to be Jesuitical, the words are in there. Proof is very important. Competency is very important. Capability is very important. Academic credentials are very important. But there is another minor, not so minor, but very important element, which is professional. That is demonstrable, that you can, there's a credential to say that not alone have you had the knowledge, but you have applied it very successfully. Finally, that's the dream. That's what we are here about. Thank you especially to the ICBE, to Mark Brown, and particularly to Mairead McGillivan, hope I got her name right, for what they have done. It's an excellent report. Where we go from here is a challenge, but our piece to the challenge would be micro-credentials in professional competency. Thanks to everybody, and well done, and a great day's work, and I'm very proud to be associated with it. And thank you especially, Grania.
Great,
Okay.
Thank you, Eamon. Thanks very much. Thanks everybody for your time today, especially the 4 speakers, of course, and all the teams behind them, and indeed to the other 5 SkillNet networks, as has been mentioned already. We will send on the links that are in the chat here. We'll send those on to you afterwards, and those will include the insights paper and, of course, the roadmap. This is recorded also, so we will be able to send you the recording, because I think there was a lot of information given out there, which is great, but a lot to chew on. So that's really it. Thanks to everyone, and we look forward to the next steps in our micro-credential journey. Thank you. Bye.